Derek Chauvin sentence.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Diane Macedo.
And I'm Terry Moran. Thanks so much for streaming with us. We're going to take a look now, a live look at George Floyd Square. That's the corner of Chicago Avenue and East 38th Street in Minneapolis, Minnesota, a world destination now as we prepare for former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin to be sentenced in court for the murder of George Floyd in just about an hour.
Chauvin was found guilty on 3 counts: second-degree unintentional murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter. We will have more on what to expect in just a moment. But first, we want to bring you the latest in the search for survivors in Surfside, Florida, after a deadly 12-story apartment building collapse. Officials say at least 4 people have been killed and as many as 159 are still unaccounted for. Search and rescue operations had to be paused overnight due to bad weather and danger from falling debris, but they've resumed today. The Miami-Dade Fire Department is leading that effort using dogs and sonar to try to listen for sounds under the rubble.
And Vice President Kamala Harris is making her first visit to the southern border since taking office. She toured the El Paso Central Processing Center, where she met with girls who had been detained after crossing into the United States. The Vice President's office says they drew pictures and they told the Vice President what they want to be when they grow up. Vice President Harris has faced some Republican criticism for putting off the visit, they say. Despite being tasked by President Biden with solving the immigration crisis, she told reporters that it was always the plan to come to El Paso after meeting with leaders of Guatemala and Mexico earlier this month.
And the Justice Department is suing the state of Georgia over its controversial election reform law. Attorney General Merrick Garland announced the lawsuit, which alleges the new state law violates the Voting Rights Act. Garland said the law includes provisions that, quote, make it harder for people to vote, and that the restrictions were passed, quote, with the purpose of denying or abridging the right to vote on account of race or color. Georgia Governor Brian Kemp says the lawsuit is born out of lies and misinformation, and that he's looking forward to fighting it. And as we mentioned, former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin is expected to be sentenced in about an hour for the murder of George Floyd. Let's go live to Minneapolis and ABC's Alex Perez, who's been covering this story for us all year. Alex, run us through how this hearing is expected to go this afternoon.
Well, Diane, as you mentioned, he was convicted on 3 charges, but the judge will sentence him on the most serious of those charges. That was a second-degree murder. That's the most serious of the charges. And here's how we expect things to unfold once the hearing gets started at about 1:30 local time, Central Time here. The attorneys for each side will present their arguments to the judge. We know that prosecutors will be asking for about 30 years behind bars. We also know that the defense attorney, Eric Nelson, has indicated he's going to ask the judge to release Derek Chauvin on time served and probation. Now, after that, we expect several of George Floyd's family members will address the court, give their victim impact statements, talk about how his death and this entire case has affected them and community as a whole. And then there'll be an opportunity there for Derek Chauvin himself to address the court, to talk to the judge, express whatever he wants to express about this case. It's unclear if he's going to do that. There's been no indication that he plans to talk. As we remember from the trial, he did not take the stand. He did not really explain or talk during the trial, Diane. And then after that comes the sentencing itself. The judge will hand down the sentence. Judge Peter Cahill, known as a moderate sentencer. The law recommends anywhere from 10 to 15 years, but the maximum sentence could be as many as 40 years. So he has a wide range to work with there. We do know already that there are certain aggravating factors in this case that the judge has found, including the fact that that deadly restraint of George Floyd was carried out in front of children. Also that Derek Chauvin abused his power, his position of authority. So those aggravating factors allow the judge to impose a stiffer sentence. So we won't know exactly what that sentence could be until the judge issues that. And somewhere in between all of that, Diane, we expect the judge is going to take a 15-minute break. So the actual sentencing, that'll be the very end of the hearing today, Diane.
All right, Alex Perez for us in Minneapolis. Alex, thank you.
And now I'd like to bring in attorney Lance Russo and ABC News contributor and civil rights attorney Shauna Lloyd for more. Welcome to both of you. So, Shauna, Derek Chauvin's team made a last-ditch attempt for a new trial, to be expected here. Judge Cahill denied that motion. But so why would the defense team ask for that today, knowing that sentencing is this afternoon? Is that typical?
That is typical. They're going to try any avenue, whether it's appeals, new trials. You, as a defense attorney, are going to try for every method to possibly have this retried, knowing that you have a guilty verdict.
And Lance, Cahill has a pretty big range to play with here in terms of how long this sentence can be. So what are some of the main factors he has to consider?
I think one of the things is the aggravating factors. He found 4 of them were proven beyond a reasonable doubt, and those are going to guide a great deal. The particular cruelty is very troubling and should be troubling for the defense, because that's a factor that is going to be explored by the victim impact statements. Another factor on the other side of the case is that Derek Chauvin's 45 years old. So a 20-year sentence, 30-year sentence, that's basically could be a life sentence. In addition, he will have to be in solitary confinement, probably whatever sentence that he serves, probably every day of that sentence.
And Shauna, as Alex mentioned, defendants are allowed to speak at these proceedings, but that could be tricky for Chauvin, since he still has a pending federal case accusing him of violating Floyd's civil rights. So do you think we'll hear from him today?
If we're going to hear from him, this is probably the only time. I didn't expect him to testify during the trial because it's just not advised with a jury. Now, when you're talking about the judge, this is the only time that he'll get to appeal directly to the judge regarding the sentencing. And so if he's going to say anything, this would be the time to say it. And yes, he would be careful about what he says, but I think he would talk about his community service, his life he's lived, the fact that he's had no priors, things of that nature. You won't hear much about the act itself because of the pending charges.
And Lance, we just saw the maximum sentences allowed under each of the charges. And a lot of people maybe watching the movies, they think about the hanging judge. The judge can just go off and impose a sentence. Can you talk about how much leeway Judge Cahill has here, given the statutory penalties, and how much discretion he has, and how those guidelines work in how a judge like him would sentence someone like Derek Chauvin?
Sure. So I'm not licensed in that state, but generally there may be nuances there. But the bottom line is the judges have a range, and those aggravating factors are a wild card, because the aggravating factors generally allow the judge to go beyond that range. You know, a lot of people talk about the maximum effect and the maximum sentence, and that's all that's acceptable. If the judges could hand out maximum sentences every time there was an issue or a minimum sentence, then we wouldn't need judges to listen to victim impact statements and listen to information from both sides. So I expect what we'll probably get is less than the maximum sentence. I think the judge will probably go into detail about why, which I think the public needs to hear, is why the judge is giving the sentence they're giving. And also, as this judge in particular, Judge Cahill, I think has gone over and above what was required of him to involve the community and let people understand that this was an open trial with an open process.
And Shauna, quickly, knowing Chauvin is also facing federal charges, could he be looking at extra prison time in addition to whatever he gets today?
There is a possibility of that. It's going to depend on whether the federal court finds that his sentence, if found guilty, should run concurrently at the same time, or if it should run consecutively. If they find that it should run consecutively, he could be looking at additional time after time served.
And finally, and quickly, if I go back to you, Lance, if prosecutors don't like the sentence, can they appeal? Is there anything they can do about it?
Yeah, they could probably file a motion for reconsideration. That may be jurisdiction dependent, but there's going to be a lot going on in this case. There's going to be a sentencing, there'll be appeals, and there are grounds that probably Eric Nelson will try to bring to an appellate court. And that's not unusual, but some of the grounds that were raised here are interesting and unique because of all the pretrial publicity and all the unrest that was going on. That's not something that courts deal with on a regular basis, and I think an appellate court will probably look at it.
For sure. So this case, far from over, but that is the wheels of justice grind slow but exceedingly fine, as they say. Shauna Lloyd and Lance Russo, thanks very much.
Thanks for having me.
And that does it for us right now on ABC News Live. I'm Diane Macedo.
And I'm Terry Moran. We're going to have complete coverage of the sentencing of Derek Chauvin coming up at 2:30 p.m. Eastern, right here on ABC News Live. But first, we have an encore presentation now of After Floyd, the year that shook the world, a Soul of a Nation special. That starts right now.
You can be a bother who dyes his hair Dennis Rodman blue in the face of the man kneeling in blue in the face, the music of his wrist. Watch your mouth is little more than a door being knocked out of the ring of fire. Around the afternoon came evening's bell of the ball and chain around the neck of the unarmed brother, ground down to gunpowder. Dirt can be inhaled like a puff, the magic bullet point of transformation both kills and fires the life of the party like it's 1999 bottles of beer on the Wall Street. People who sleep in the streets do not sleep without counting yourself lucky. Rabbit's foot of the mountain lion. Do not sleep without making your bed of the riverboat. Gambling, there will be no stormy weather on the waterboard. To death, any means of killing time is on your side of the bed of the truck. Transporting Emmett till the break of day. Emmett till the river runs dry your face, the music of the spheres. Emmett till the end of time.
Good evening, I'm TJ Holmes.
And I'm Tamron Hall. Welcome to this very special edition of Soul of a Nation.
Now, today marks exactly 1 year since the death of George Floyd, a man whose killing sparked a global movement and created seismic changes in nearly every facet of American life.
But we begin right here in Minneapolis, Minnesota, just steps away from the place where George Floyd would take his last breaths, crying out for his mother. We've all seen that video and the disturbing images. That will stay with us forever. But in this hour, we've decided we're not showing it.
You will not see it here tonight. Instead, we are going to focus on his life. We're going to focus on George Floyd's story. We're going to talk to the people who knew him best. And we'll look at this past year, examine how that tragedy, that crime, those 9 minutes and 29 seconds sent shockwaves through the world that continue to reverberate today.
George Floyd's senseless death was a flashpoint for change, but his life deserves a closer look. His family and friends are sharing how they want the world to remember the man they affectionately called Big Floyd.
George Floyd lived life like most of us. He made good choices and some bad choices. He tried to be good to people. And on that day, he was mostly minding his own business on the day that he was killed. For this generation of Americans, this will be their Emmett Till moment. They will never forget the summer of 2020, the death of George Floyd.
We lived in the CUNY homes. It was the projects. It was the housing authority. Low income. It was a rough neighborhood. But to me, it's like, it's life.
At the heart of George's family was his mother, Miss Sissy.
He loved his mom, and his mom loved him too, and it was no secret. Everybody knew.
George and my mom, as you watched them, that Love and Happiness song with Al Green, they used to always play the music. Love and happiness. He would literally pick her up and dance with her to that song. And my mom would just smile.
George was special, and he used to always be able to go places and people would fall in love with him just like that.
Douglas Elementary was listed as the 5th poorest school in Houston ISD. The boys and girls would write an essay on what I want to be when I grow up. When I grow up, I want to be a Supreme Court judge. When people say, Your Honor, he did rob the bank, I will say, be seated. He was a good student. He was a really quiet student until he got on the playground.
Floyd, he was good in football and basketball.
That's his territory. Nobody could mess with him on the court.
I remember they threw him a pass. He jumped up, extended his body all the way out, caught the ball, and he ballerina tapped in the back of the end zone.
Floyd's scholarship offer brought promise to them projects more than people even know.
George would be the first in his family to go to college, but he'd be back home within 2 years.
The police used to do sweeps in the CUNY homes. I thought they just did that in every community.
He would have trouble with the law. The most serious arrest, aggravated robbery. He pled guilty and served 4 years.
It goes from not just you losing your career and your future, it goes to now fighting to have freedom in any parts of your life.
I met Big Floyd at the time he was out of prison. We needed somebody who was a gatekeeper, who people respected and who could open doors. And Big Floyd was that person for us. What I saw with Big Floyd was redemption. He was using the fact that he was an OG in the neighborhood and was helping young men everywhere from 5 to 50 walk that path.
Our young generation is clearly lost, man. Clearly lost, man. Like one day it's gonna be you and God. You going up or you going down. You know what I'm saying?
But there were internal battles, and George made the decision to follow a well-known path to seek help. Locals call it going to Minneapolis.
He needed to get away from the environment. He needed that change. He wanted to just be a better man and a better father, you know. And he did it.
He used to call me Buttercup because I was his baby. And that we had all the happy memories together.
George attended a treatment program, worked security jobs, tried trucking school, but struggles would come.
Minneapolis is known for having some of the steepest disparities between black and white residents, really white and everybody else.
Minnesota nice. How ironic, right?
A year before he died, George faced a crushing loss.
His mother's death took a toll on him. He didn't know how to handle that.
This faithful man was devastated at the time. Like he was weakened.
And then came COVID. George, like so many Americans, would be laid off and contract the virus.
When he came to stop by, they just told me, you know, struggling a little bit. Yeah.
And violent deaths like those of Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery were anguishing communities.
By the time we're on the cusp of Memorial Day, people just want relief from the psychological trauma of everything that they've been feeling.
On that holiday Monday, in Cup Foods, George's alleged use of a counterfeit bill, just $20, would ultimately lead to the police being called.
You know, he started hearing commotions. George is again on the ground pleading, you know, for his life.
Mr. Floyd's saying he can't breathe. The officer's saying he can breathe if he can talk. It's not true.
Once you just get him up, he's not resisting arrest. You have him handcuffed. I kept voicing my concerns for George, you know, to the police. No response. I watched this man murder another man that looked like me for no reason.
That was a modern-day lynching.
Then when I heard him say, "Mama," like, that's when it got real with me.
And people all around the world seen that video, And they was like, where's the humanity? They was like, no, you're not gonna sweep this under the rug. We're gonna march.
Coming up, unrest ignites.
All hell breaks loose.
The protest that unmasked a tipping point for Black America.
Enough had just been enough.
When Soul of a Nation returns.
24 hours, assault on the Capitol. The ABC News original, exclusively on Hulu. Now streaming. With so much at stake, so much on the line, more Americans turn here than any other newscast. ABC News World News Tonight with David Muir.
We have made it through another week together.
America's #1 most watched newscast across all of television.
The world may feel out of your control, but your happiness doesn't have to be. Learn the secrets to happiness. Listen to the 10% Happier podcast, free on Apple Podcasts.
Robin Roberts, George Stephanopoulos, Michael Strahan. Wake up with America's #1 most watched morning show. ABC's
Good Morning America.
ABC News honored winner for the second straight year with the Edward R. Murrow Award for overall excellence in television. ABC News, America's #1 news source.
That video was so violent, so graphic.
No more could we live in a society where it's acceptable for a person to be murdered in cold blood. Enough had just been enough.
After I saw the video, I shared it on social media and I said we need to put an event together to demand justice.
Within a few days, thousands of protesters had descended on Minneapolis. Most were peaceful, but there was violence.
If we don't get no justice, there ain't gonna be no damn peace.
We saw the police show up in riot gear.
And they were shooting tear gas and firing rubber bullets, trying to control the crowd. They had inflicted such trauma on the community that to take a position of law and order was actually insane.
Soon, the protests were spontaneously spreading across the nation. By June 1st, the protesters had reached the nation's capital. That night, a clash of protesters and police on this quiet, narrow street.
There was troops, paramilitaries, authority figures in riot gear with guns on this corner.
A block away, Rahul Dubey could not believe what he was seeing.
All hell breaks loose.
People are screaming and panicking, and it is literally a human tsunami coming down this street that is being chopped down by these authority figures.
Jenny, who has been protesting since she was 15 years old, says the memories of that night still haunt her.
This was honestly the first time that I was met with such violence and aggression from the police. I was trying to figure a way out, and there was no way out.
In the midst of the chaos, Rahul made a split-second decision.
What are you so afraid of? Just people.
Rahul flung the door open and let people in.
He's like, come on. I'm like, all right, we got to take this opportunity. I'm not trying to get arrested tonight.
He opened his home to 72 protesters, strangers, many of them suffering from the sting of tear gas.
We're okay here?
Yeah, you are.
Is everybody in this house okay here?
We appreciate you, brother.
Thank you.
So at that point, you say, I'm going to open the door, and you let them in.
I saw humans intentionally hurting my sisters and brothers feet away from me.
Around the same time, actor Kendrick Sampson was protesting the murder of George Floyd in Los Angeles.
It was one of the most beautiful demonstrations I've ever been a part of.
While he was protesting, Kendrick says the police became violent.
Hey, hands up! Hey, bro, watch it! Oh! Police showed up right at the end, and the aggression just grew and grew until they were beating people with batons.
Stop
shooting American citizens.
Moments after the attack, Sampson turned to social media to show the world his injuries.
You see this? Baton, rubber bullets. Dude looked at me in my eye and aimed straight at me.
He says the abuse left him traumatized.
I would wake up with adrenaline, just my heart racing. I have a lot of trauma that I still have to work through.
A year later, the LAPD now undergoing reforms and training to address more appropriate protest response. Lifelong civil rights leader Reverend Al Sharpton delivered George Floyd's eulogy with words that became a rallying cry.
It's time for us to stand up in George's name and say, get your knee off our necks.
I'm watching you deliver the sermon. Get your knee off our necks. You said it and you preached it.
I looked down at that casket of George Floyd, and it hit me that all of us have fought this knee on our necks all our lives, whether we were billionaire black businessmen, whether we were women getting overlooked for a job, and it just bubbled up in me that all we want you to do is get your knee off our neck.
August 28th, Reverend Sharpton leads the commitment march on Washington. And as he looked out at the thousands in attendance, Reverend Sharpton remembers a conversation between President Biden and George Floyd's daughter, Gianna.
She said, my daddy's gonna change the world. When I stood there on those steps where Dr. King had stood 57 years before and looked at that mass crowd, I thought about that little girl.
That changed the world.
I said, she's right. I don't know how, but I know her daddy's changed the world.
1 year later, the lessons of a movement. What was the epiphany from that moment?
Here's a beautiful black human being getting murdered for no reason, and why is that not bothering me enough to do anything? The recognition that I have racial tendencies, I have cognitive bias, and I have to look at myself as if I am the racist number one and address that in me first. To have that introspection with the help of my new family members and people of color and black Americans that were in this house with me.
All different people, different ages, different races coming together, and yet it all centralized in this house. This house becomes a microcosm of the whole movement.
The connection that was made here was so natural. Leading with love, it doesn't matter where you come from, what walk of life.
That's a new phrase, leading with love.
Just lead with love. It's not hard. It takes a lot of effort to hate, to appreciate. That's it.
Still ahead.
He's changed the world.
What does a year of change look like?
No aspect of American society was untouched.
And later, a soul-stirring performance from musician Aloe Black when Soul of a Nation returns.
We will guide you through it all tonight. We have made it through another week together.
Give me a big hug, Griffin.
We tell all our patients how much they're loved. We hold their hands.
David, we're showing our love and support for all the ICU staff.
They're the heroes in this.
Now, when it matters most, the straightforward facts. ABC News is America's #1 news. Good Morning America, #1 in the morning, 9 years running. World News Tonight with David Muir, #1 in the evening with America's most watched newscast. 2020, the #1 news magazine on Friday nights. The View, the #1 daytime talk show. And ABC News Live, #1 in streaming news. ABC News is America's #1 news. Friday nights, 9/8 Central. True crime, cinematic, real-life drama, stunning, the unthinkable. Follow the clues. The Hunt. True crime. 2020. Friday nights, 9/8 Central on ABC.
We march together.
most powerful stories of our time, anytime. Nightline.
Welcome back. In the aftermath of George Floyd's death, some Confederate monuments were toppled, boycotts were embraced by big business, and school curriculums have been re-examined. The progress feels swift and effective, but is it lasting? Here now, ABC's Janae Norman.
Last summer, the bedrock of our country began to shift as the George Floyd protests reverberated across the culture.
No aspect of American society was untouched.
Symbols of racism being torn down around the world.
They tear them down.
It was a domino effect.
And NASCAR bans the Confederate flag.
That's a symbol of hate.
The long-running series Cops and now Live PD being pulled from the airwaves.
Bye. And good riddance.
Tonight, Washington's NFL team dropping the Redskins name and logo.
I'm happy that name is going to be eradicated.
The school board in Springfield, Virginia has voted unanimously to rename Robert E. Lee High School after John Lewis.
These are all a testament to George Floyd's legacy.
When I think about my brother, you know, he's changed the world.
It was the start of a racial reckoning so many of us never expected to see. In the midst of history, scholars like Elizabeth Alexander were charting out the future. Last year, 2020, the Mellon Foundation launched a pretty massive initiative, $250 million to help reimagine the landscape of memorials and monuments around the country.
Well, this is called the Monuments Project. It is the biggest initiative in Mellon's history. We began to think about what all of these Confederate monuments and buildings named for Confederate heroes, what is that teaching us? Plain and simple, that is teaching us to venerate white supremacy. That was a problem to address.
When you see the statue of Robert E. Lee and the images projected up on that statue, do you think that that is a good use of that space, a reclaiming of sorts?
I feel it's ideal. I feel it's spectacular. In the face of George Floyd or Breonna Taylor, you see the ongoing cost if we continue to live in the way that this country's been living.
While much of our memorial landscape centers white men, artist Hank Willis Thomas is changing that with pieces like Unity in downtown Brooklyn.
During the protests last summer, this was a rallying point where people would come and there was like a huge police presence and all the protests in Brooklyn would be coming down the street. It was really amazing.
Unity is a 22.5-foot bronze arm representing ambition, perseverance, and upward mobility.
I've always thought about artists as kind of like psychics, where a lot of us are living in and imagining the world that we want to see and then going about building it.
His next project, The Embrace, will honor Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King.
The Embrace was inspired by a photograph I saw of the Kings when Dr. King was being awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Like, he's hugging her, and you can see her literally holding him up, and this was something that was so special.
In the years since Floyd, the memorial landscape isn't the only thing getting a makeover.
Let me fix you some breakfast. Aunt Jemima.
After a social media uproar sparked by this TikTok and the larger Floyd movement.
Did you know the name Aunt Jemima means slave mammy of the plantation South?
Like those monuments, Aunt Jemima toppled.
Quaker now saying after 131 years, it is changing the name and packaging of Aunt Jemima, acknowledging the brand is based on a racial stereotype.
The brand, first introduced in 1889, is rooted in a 19th century minstrel song, Old Aunt Jemima, a stereotypical mammy caricature that falsely suggests the enslaved were happy. Obviously, her appearance has changed over the years, but when we look back, we still see that mammy caricature.
Yeah, the Aunt Jemima brand is based on a horrible racial stereotype. And over the course of the brand's history, there were attempts to evolve that image over time. And last June, you know, on the wake of George Floyd, we made a statement that that Aunt Jemima brand needed to retire.
With all due respect, why did it take so long and a tragedy of such epic proportion to do the right thing?
These are complex questions because the brand has meant many things to many people over the course of history. It clearly was time to move beyond removing that harmful negative stereotype from the marketplace.
Aunt Jemima will now be Pearl Milling Company. New packages hit shelves in June, and the company has also pledged to give back.
We're investing in small Black-owned businesses, our minority and Black-owned suppliers, and we're placing dollars in the communities where they matter the most.
No justice, no peace. No.
Call it a long overdue correction or getting real about our real history. The Floyd effect has even rippled through American schools.
We keep telling the same tragic story over and over.
When I think back to Black History at school, it was February 1st to February 28th, right. And then you're talking about slavery, and people in class are looking around at you, and you're like,
look at you.
It's that time.
Even the teachers have this sympathetic look. They're like,
yeah, and you're sitting in class, and you're like, okay, here we go. Right. Yes, because I'm the Black one in class.
I'm like, hi.
Okay, here we go. Right. Yes, because I'm the Black one in class.
I'm like, hi. Yeah.
Last summer in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, 12-year-old Abele Azikiwe wrote a letter to her principal asking to be taught more than just the basics of slavery and a few famous icons.
There are other people to teach us than Martin Luther King and Harriet Tubman that are important.
Ultimately, the district made Black history a high school graduation requirement. Nationally, diversifying curriculums has been met with backlash by conservatives, but it hasn't deterred the Cherry Hill School District.
I feel proud, and I don't want to stop, having these conversations.
Conversations across America. It's what Floyd sparked. A legacy that's still unfolding.
Maybe it'll be the kids of today that can really interpret this time. All I know is it's a different time. The temperature has changed in America.
Coming up, the verdict.
I think we exhaled. America exhaled.
But what's next? We take you inside one community's fight for police reform. When Soul of a Nation returns.
Now, when it matters most, the straightforward facts. ABC News is America's #1 news. Good Morning America, #1 in the morning, 9 years running. World News Tonight with David Muir, #1 in the evening with America's most watched newscast. 2020, the #1 news magazine on Friday nights. The View, the #1 daytime talk show. And ABC News Live, #1 in streaming news. ABC News is America's #1 news.
The most powerful stories of our time, anytime. Nightline.
Friday nights, 9/8 Central. True crime, cinematic, real-life drama, stunning, the unthinkable. Follow the clues, The Hunt. True crime, 2020. Friday nights, 9/8 Central on ABC.
Admit it. These days, what you need to know
seems to change just about every day.
What is it that you really want to know, need to know?
To help you not just get through your day,
but to make the most of it. Feel smarter.
Feel better.
Feel happier.
Well, how about a third hour of Good Morning America in the afternoon?
GMA 3, what you need to know. Lunchtime at 1 Eastern, 12 Central and Pacific on ABC. It's all about you.
I know what happened, and I'm not guilty.
Why the fascination with criminal trials? Figure out what's really out there.
She revealed she had murdered his family.
I know in my heart they did this. It's the time of suspicion.
The ending's really tough. You don't know whether truth is going to be difficult to find unless you try to find it.
Welcome back. 10
7 months and 26 days after George Floyd's death, the guilty verdict in the case of the officer who killed him was an exhale felt around the world. But is justice really achieved if we don't achieve lasting reform?
As the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act stalls in the Senate, one city in New Jersey may already have a plan to take policing in a new direction. Here now, Nightline co-anchor Byron Pitts.
Members of the jury, I understand you have a verdict. Verdict, count one. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty.
Justice in this one case for this one family. Finally, it was not denied. But too many days, a new injustice. Over 1,000 people have been killed by the police in the years since George Floyd's murder, even despite more than 100 new reform laws.
It may be true that the law cannot change the heart, but it can restrain the heartless.
The country has given us the opportunity to lead.
The George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. Advocates hoping his death could serve to finally push through historic changes to policing across the country.
We have 18,000 police departments in the United States, 18,000 ways of policing. That needs to be modernized, professionalized. There needs to be accountability, there needs to be transparency, and there needs to be accreditation.
But federal reforms have stalled. The Floyd family on this grim anniversary, meeting with President Biden and lawmakers.
We need to be working together to make sure that people do not live in fear in America.
Meanwhile, in Minnesota, George Floyd's sister, Bridget, disappointed that 1 year later, the act still hasn't passed.
Biden has broke a promise.
For so many people of color in this country, there's no time to waste.
What did you think when you first saw the George Floyd video?
I couldn't breathe. It's symbolic to how we come up as black men and women in society, that somebody's on our neck.
Damon Durden grew up on the streets of Newark's toughest neighborhoods.
When I seen the police, I would run. And I was a child. I didn't even do nothing. I looked at them as an occupying force.
Newark, New Jersey, Brick City, where in 2016 the government used a powerful tool, a consent decree, to force change in Newark. And the results, at least for now, are staggering. Crime has been steadily down. And in all of 2020, not one Newark police officer fired a single shot. Not one.
How is it possible in a large city in America?
That's just one example of the results of all the work that's been going on in the city of Newark over the last at least 5 years, right? The Department of Justice issued their findings report. Anything you can think of as being wrong in policing in the U.S., they said was happening here in Newark, from bias in stops, searches, and arrests, excessive force.
It is a handbook on how not to police.
Yes, exactly.
The consent decree compelled the city to make changes. They created and rewrote policies, hired more social workers, and greatly increased the diversity of its force. Now some within the city hope Newark could be a model of reform for the entire country.
Come on over. I already know you know good soup. All right now.
What does the old guard say about this? Are they buying it?
It depends on who you talk to. But yeah, I think they're buying it because they see that it's necessary. Some of them, I think they see that the old practices can't continue. Well, I tell cops all the time, if you treat people, the citizens that you police, like your family, we'll never have an issue.
Reform in Newark only possible because the whole city has bought in, from the cops to the community.
Quickly, y'all, we just want to discuss some of the things that we've been dealing with this week.
The Newark Community Street Team trains and deploys outreach workers to mediate high-risk disputes, provide safe passage to and from school, and provide community services and support.
What's your mission?
Well, our mission is really to bring healing to the community.
You're not doctors, are you?
We're street doctors. We're looking at violence through the public health lens.
For the 6 years the street team has been in existence, violence has been nearly cut in half.
You know, we're from the community. Many of us have been incarcerated ourselves. Now, instead of the menaces in society, we're considering ourselves the mentors of society. Law enforcement will never be the first point of contact for safety in our communities since the public execution of George Floyd. You know, people hear public safety and they think police. The word public is there first, so the public has to be involved.
For all its success, a stark truth. Remember that unprecedented no shots fired streak? Broken on the first day of 2021, when Newark police shot and killed an unarmed man. It's currently under investigation, which is why some activists say policing can't just be reformed, it must be uprooted.
These reforms are not working. And what's needed is something that's more systemic and that deals with the root causes of why we are in these situations in the first place. The BREATHE Act is a comprehensive approach. Over 90% of the BREATHE Act is investments. It invests in the things that we know keep communities safe.
In the end, what plagues America did not start with police, nor can it end there.
We carry an incredibly shameful history with us in the United States, but we also carry the legacy of fighting. And the torch is being passed to every single one of us to do our part.
Up next, Sunny Hostin is back with a very special In the Kitchen with mothers who lost their sons at the hands of police.
What does fixing this problem look like for you?
It's a conversation you don't want to miss after the break.
With so much at stake, so much on the line, more Americans turn here than any other newscast. ABC News World News Tonight with David Muir.
We have made it through another week together.
America's #1 most watched newscast across all of television.
Robin Roberts, George Stephanopoulos, Michael Strahan. Wake up with America's #1 most watched morning show. ABC's
Good Morning America.
The world may feel out of your control, but your happiness doesn't have to be. Learn the secrets to happiness. Listen to the 10% Happier podcast, free on Apple Podcasts.
ABC News honored winner for the second straight year with the Edward R. Murrow Award for Overall Excellence in Television. ABC News, America's #1 news source. Friday nights, 9/8 Central. True crime, cinematic, real-life drama, stunning, the unthinkable. Follow the clues, The Hunt, True Crime, 2020. Friday nights, 9/8 Central on ABC. Now, when it matters most, the straightforward facts. ABC News is America's #1 news. Good Morning America, #1 in the morning, 9 years running. World News Tonight with David Muir, #1 in the evening with America's most watched newscast. 2020, the #1 news magazine on Friday nights. The View, the #1 daytime talk show. And ABC News Live, #1 in streaming news. ABC News is America's #1 news.
Welcome back to Soul of a Nation. Lives lost at the hands of police have left families heartbroken and shattered.
And tonight we are hearing from Valerie Bell, whose son Sean Bell was shot to death by police while leaving his bachelor party.
Michelle Kinney, the mother of Antoine Rose II. Antoine was just 17 when East Pittsburgh police shot him in the back.
And Leslie McSpadden, the mother of Michael Brown. We all know his story. Brown was killed by police in Ferguson, Missouri. His death ignited a global movement as well.
Here's Sunny Hostin with a very special In the Kitchen.
Welcome to the kitchen, ladies, and I'm just so honored and humbled to have you here.
Thank you so much for having us.
I want to talk about the verdict in the Derek Chauvin trial in the murder of George Floyd. When you heard the verdict, did it feel different to you?
No, it didn't feel different to me because the Floyd family still had to lay George Floyd to rest.
Valerie?
Like Leslie said, it didn't feel different because I'm seeing guilty on George Floyd. Officer that killed him is like accountability was held, but not justice.
What do you mean by that, not justice?
Justice for me, and hopefully for a lot of people, is when they stop killing Afro-Americans while they walk, or if they run, or if they're in a car getting ready to go somewhere, or even if an officer stops a young person and ask a question, why we can't answer them without being terrorized by the officers. So that's justice for me.
I was happy for the family, but I know the pain that comes with just having to bury your loved one. So, no. And I know America probably doesn't want to hear that, but nothing has changed, because while the verdict was being read, another black person was being murdered.
And another one, and another one, and another one.
Nothing changed.
We're still holding our breath, feeling as if we died that day with our children. So it's not over. There's no change. There's no relief for us. I felt like this was my fault.
Like it was your fault?
I felt like that, because as a parent, you're the protector. And you know you didn't pull the trigger or anything, but that's your baby. And if you weren't there to help them or to hold them or to take any of the pain, it's a part of you that feels responsible. It's a part of you that hurts, and you beat yourself up and you feel guilty. And I felt that for a long time.
I've interviewed so many, as I mentioned, mothers who've lost their children, but I've never heard it explained in that way, that as a mother, you feel somewhat responsible for it.
You do.
And that is just, it's incomprehensible to me. And both of you started crying.
Because you feel like you weren't there to protect them.
And you felt that way too?
Yeah. Because we weren't there to protect them. As a mom, you feel like you are the protector. That's my baby. I protected him in life, and I felt like I should have been there to protect him from death.
Yes. That's how close we are to our children.
Yes.
And my husband always say a woman who carries a baby knows their son or daughter before the father.
It's true.
And now I know what he really means by that.
Yeah.
We'll do anything for him.
Anything.
Anything for them, yes.
That is true.
Yes.
What do you want people to know about your sons?
I knew my son down to his toes. To this day, he was very kind. But he was a mama's boy. He spent a lot of time with me. We had a lot of conversations. And for that, I'm grateful. Because I love my son, and I knew he loved me. Sometimes they try to make our children out to be villains.
Yeah.
And the media has a bad habit of picking up on that without vetting the information. I think that Antoine's life was cut so short that the world missed out on a great opportunity. Because I knew from the time my son was born that he was going to change the world.
I want people to remember him, the gift that God gave him to be a baseball player. He went to John Adams High School. In 1999, they won the championship. He was a pitcher, dynamite pitcher. On the night of his bachelor party, he received a call from the Dodgers camp. So I knew he was going to be somebody and go somewhere. And now I'm here to let them know he was going to be somebody.
That's what?
Yeah.
He is somebody.
He is somebody.
Yep. Yeah.
I want to let people know that Michael came from a loving family, and today is his 25th birthday.
So I understand that you have a poem to share with us.
Yes, I do.
Okay.
I need a guided ear. The world will know Mike was here. So now I am here, standing in the gap, leaning on my faith. Lord, help me find the same space to lay these broken pieces, preparing for the day where I can feel the sun's warmth on my face, looking justice in the eyes and knowing that finally I am okay. Thank you.
I just wonder if people know how bad this hurts.
I think mothers know. It has to stop.
It does. It needs to.
And I think with you sharing your stories and your pain, we're on the road to maybe trying to make it stop. So I thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Straight ahead, a riveting musical performance from Aloe Black that is right on key with the times.
I know what happened, and I'm not guilty.
Why the fascination with criminal trials? Figure out what's really out there.
She revealed she had murdered his family.
I know in my heart they did this.
It's the time of suspicion.
The ending's really tough.
You don't know whether truth is going to be difficult to find unless you try to find it.
Hours, Assault on the Capitol, the ABC News original, exclusively on Hulu, now streaming. With so much at stake, so much on the line, more Americans turn here than any other newscast. ABC News World News Tonight with David Muir.
We have made it through another week together.
America's #1 most watched newscast across all of television.
The world may feel out of your control, but your happiness doesn't have to be. Learn the secrets to happiness. Listen to the 10% Happier podcast, free on Apple Podcasts.
Robin Roberts, George Stephanopoulos, Michael Strahan. Wake up with America's #1 most watched morning show. ABC's
Good Morning America.
ABC News honored winner for the second straight year with the Edward R. Murrow Award for overall excellence in television. ABC News, America's #1 news source.
Welcome back. Aloe Black, that voice, soulful, and he is nothing short of inspiring.
You're so right, and here he is performing his song, Other Side.
We've been to walls we couldn't climb, and we chased the light that made us blind. But I know we can walk this road one step at a time. No matter how far, no matter how wide. Your hand I'll hold, and you hold mine. No matter how long, no matter how tight. And together we'll weather the storm, it'll be alright. 'Cause if you're calling, then I'm all in. Even if I'm falling, saving you is gonna save my life. And if you're ready, I'll hold you steady when the load is heavy, and we can make it to the other side. We lost our breath in smoke and fire as we tried to balance on this wire. But I know we can find our way if we take time. No matter how long, no matter how tight. And together we'll weather the storm, it'll be alright. 'Cause if you're calling, then I'm all in. Even if I'm falling, saving you is gonna save my life. And if you're ready, I'll hold you steady when the load is heavy, and we can make it to the other side. Yeah, yeah, we can make it to the other side. Yeah, yeah, we can make it to the other side. And we can make it to the other side. And we can make it to the other side.
Thank you so much to Aloe Black for that incredible performance. And thank you for joining us tonight as we looked back on the life of George Floyd and his impact on the world.
And so for all of us here at Soul of a Nation, good night.
We will guide you through it all tonight. We have made it through another week together.
Big hug, Griffin.
We tell all our patients how much they're loved. We hold their hands.
David, we're showing our love and support for all the ICU staff.
They're the heroes in this.
Now, when it matters most, the straightforward facts. ABC News is America's #1 news. Good Morning America, #1 in the morning, 9 years running. World News Tonight with David Muir, #1 in the evening with America's most watched newscast. 2020, the #1 news magazine on Friday nights. The View, the #1 daytime talk show. And ABC News Live, #1 in streaming news. ABC News is America's #1 news.
The world may feel out of your control, but your happiness doesn't have to be. Learn the secrets to happiness. Listen to the 10% Happier podcast, free on Apple Podcasts.
ABC News honored winner for the second straight year with the Edward R. Murrow Award for Overall Excellence in Television. ABC News, America's #1 news source.
This is GMA3, what you need to know. GMA3.
A third hour of Good Morning America in the afternoon.
It's all about you. Lunchtime on ABC.
Friday nights, 9/8 Central. True crime, cinematic, real-life drama, stunning, the unthinkable. Follow the clues. The Hunt. True crime. 2020. Friday nights, 9/8 Central on ABC.
The most powerful stories of our time, anytime. Nightline.
ABC News. Straightforward.
This is an ABC News special report. The death of George Floyd. Derek Chauvin sentencing.
Good afternoon. I'm Wade Johnson in New York, and we're coming on the air for the sentencing of former police officer Derek Chauvin, convicted of murdering George Floyd in Minneapolis, a case that has been a flashpoint in America, igniting a racial reckoning and demands for police reform across the U.S. and around the world. The unforgettable images, of course, of Derek Chauvin seen with his knee on George Floyd's neck. That's the still picture right there, 9 minutes and 29 seconds. And Floyd's chilling pleas, saying he can't breathe and calling for his mother. Judge Peter Cahill will issue today's sentence. He is the same judge who presided over Chauvin's trial 8 weeks ago. You may remember the jury deliberated for 9 hours, 44 minutes over 2 days before finding Chauvin guilty on all 3 counts. Now, by state law, he'll be sentenced to the most serious of those charges, second-degree murder. The maximum sentence for this charge is 40 years, but the guidelines recommend 10 to 15 years on that conviction. Now, the judge has already ruled aggravating factors in the case allow for a stiffer penalty. Those factors include Chauvin abusing his position of trust and authority, and the fact that all of this unfolded in front of children. Let's listen right here. Here is Judge Cahill with the sentence.
27 CR 20-12646. Matters on for sentencing. Counsel, note your appearances beginning with the state.
Good afternoon, Matthew Frank, Assistant Attorney General on behalf of the state.
Good afternoon, Your Honor. Jerry Blackwell for the state of Minnesota.
Good afternoon, Your Honor. Steve Slisher on behalf of the state of Minnesota.
Your Honor, Keith Ellison, Attorney General on behalf of the state of Minnesota.
And for the defense.
Good afternoon, Your Honor. Eric Nelson and Amy Voss appearing on behalf of Mr. Chauvin.
Thank you. We are still, for all those attending, under somewhat modified COVID restrictions, so we are asking that everyone keep their masks on unless they are speaking. I'll ask for people who are speaking to come up to the lectern and use the microphones, and please to remove your mask so that we can hear you clearly, and also to maintain the distances that we have set out in the courtroom. With that, we'll proceed first with the state. Mr. Blackwell, you may proceed with victim input.
Your Honor, we have 4 victim impact statements. We will start with the 7-year-old daughter of George Floyd, Gianna Floyd, who will present hers by video.
What do you miss most about your daddy?
Well, I ask about him all the time. And that's kind of it.
Yeah. Well, when you ask about him, what are you asking about?
Well, I was asking, how did my dad get hurt?
Do you wish that he was still here with us?
Yeah, but he is.
Through his spirit?
Yes.
Yes. And when you see your daddy again one day, what do you want to do when you see him?
I want to play with him.
What kind of games do you want to play with him?
I want to play with him, have fun, go on a plane ride, and that's it.
Yeah.
We used to have dinner meals every single night before we went to bed. My daddy always used to help me brush my teeth.
Oh. Do you miss him helping brush your teeth?
Yes.
How do you hope that the world remembers him?
Well, they help him because those mean people did something to him.
Yeah. If you could say anything to your daddy right now, what would it be?
It would be, I miss you and I love you.
All right. Thank you, Gianna. I really appreciate you answering questions today.
That was Gianna Floyd. Your Honor, next we'll hear from the nephew of George Floyd, Brandon Williams. Mr. Williams.
If you could begin by giving us your full name and spelling each of your names.
Brandon Williams, BRANDON WILLIAMS.
Thank you. You may proceed.
On Monday, May 25th, 2020, George Perry Floyd Jr. was murdered by Derek Chauvin in a malicious and insidious display of hate and abuse of power. Chauvin killed George. Not only did he kill George, but he also displayed a total lack of consideration for human life as he did so. You saw it, I saw it, and millions of people across this country and the globe witnessed the act of hate. A year and 1 month later, I stand there before you tasked with the duty of expressing how George's death has impacted me personally and the rest of our family. As I racked my brain and thought about what I could say today, I came to this conclusion. It is humanly impossible for me to stand here and convey or articulate the right words that would capture all that we are feeling and what we have felt over this period. So please bear with me as I attempt the impossible. The sudden murder of George has forever traumatized us. You may see us cry, but the full extent of our pain and trauma will never be seen with the naked eye. The heartbreak and hurt goes far beyond any number of tears we could ever cry. Words simply cannot express the pain, anguish, and suffering that our family and friends have endured since George's murder. It has been truly unimaginable, but not as nearly unimaginable as the defendant's decision to take the life of a human being with no regard for the effect it may have on others. Although Chauvin will be sentenced today and spend time in prison, he will have the luxury of seeing his family again, talking to them, and he will likely get to spend time with them upon his release. These are all luxuries that my young cousin Gianna was robbed of when Chauvin made the active decision to kill our father. There will be no more birthday parties, no graduations, holiday gatherings, or other family celebrations. The laughter, hugs, guidance, advice, sense of security, and those opportunities to simply say I love you are forever gone. They say time heals all, And while I generally believe that saying, it's challenging to do so given these unfathomable set of circumstances. Before I conclude, I must highlight a few things. George's murder, this trial, and everything in between has been tragic and devastating. Our family is forever broken. And one thing we cannot get back is George Floyd. It is the request of my family that the maximum penalty for the crime for which the defendant was convicted be imposed. On behalf of my family, friends, community, and supporters, I wish to express my sincerest gratitude for allowing us opportunities of expression. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Your Honor, first, just for the record, this wonderful lady standing here is a Hennepin County victim advocate.
Ms. Boswell is well known to the court.
Yes, thank you, Judge.
And so, Your Honor, we'll next hear from the brother of George Floyd, Mr. Terrence Floyd.
And Mr. Floyd, if you could state your full name, spelling each of your names.
Yes. Terrence Floyd. That's Terrence, Floyd, Floyd.
Go ahead.
I'm here representing my brother. I'm from New York. On May 25th, 2020, my brother was murdered, everyone knows, by Derek Chauvin. The facts of this case were proven beyond a reasonable doubt, and 3 guilty verdicts have been rendered. This situation has really affected me and my family. Any family member that has went through this, we are part of a fraternity of families, and it's not one of those, fraternities that you enjoy. I just, over this last year and months, I actually talked to a few people, and I wanted to know from the man himself why. What were you thinking? What was going through your head when you had your knee on my brother's neck? Why when you knew that he posed no threat anymore, he was handcuffed, why you didn't at least get up? Why you stayed there? A month before my brother was murdered, I was on the phone with him, and we had a long conversation. And as I looked at the video of my niece, the last conversation me and my brother had was he wanted to have play dates. He wanted to plan play dates with Gianna and my daughter. And we started setting it up. That can't happen. And I have to, my daughter's still young, but I still have to explain to her, because this is history. This is a case everybody knows about. So she's gonna find out, and I'm gonna have to explain that to her. And I think that's, to me, harder than even just standing here, that I have to talk to my daughter and tell her, about her niece, about her uncle, about the situation. That's basically reliving it all over again, years down the line. I'm here on behalf of my family, on behalf of me and my family, we seek the maximum penalty. We don't want to see no more slaps on the wrists. We've been through that already. In my community, in my culture, we've been through that already. Smacked on the wrist. No. Because if it was us, if the roles was reversed, there wouldn't be no case. It would have been open and shut. We'd have been under the jail for murdering somebody. So we asked for that same penalty for Derek Chauvin. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Your Honor, the final victim impact statement for the state will come from George Floyd's brother, Phalonis Floyd.
And sir, if you could begin by giving us your full name and spell each of your names, and I have permitted you to use your phone because you have notes on it. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
All right. And you may proceed when you're ready. Giving us your full name first.
Phalonis Floyd, spelled P-H-I-L-O-N-I-S-E. Last name Floyd, F-L-O-Y-D.
And you may proceed.
One year ago, May 25th, my brother George was murdered by Derek Chauvin and his co-defendants in broad daylight with a knee to his neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. I was a trucker, and immediately my life changed forever. I began to speak to the world for George from the United Nations, Africa, Canada, Japan, and so many other countries. Every day, I have begged for justice to be served, reliving the execution of George, while others begged and pleaded for Officer Chauvin to simply just allow George to take a breath. I haven't had a real night's sleep because of the nightmares I constantly have hearing my brother beg and plead for his life over and over again. Even saying, "They're going to kill me. Please, officer." Screaming for our mom. I have had to sit through each day of Officer Derek Chauvin's trial and watch the video of George dying for hours over and over again. For an entire year, I had to relive George being tortured to death every hour of the day, only taking naps and not knowing what a good night's sleep is anymore. I've been lifting my voice tirelessly every day so that George's death will not be in vain. Honorable Judge Peter K. Hill, I thank you for allowing me to share this today. George's life mattered. So my family and I, most of all, my niece, Gianna, she needs closure. I'm asking that you please find it suitable to give Officer Chauvin the maximum sentence possible, charge that he has been found guilty for. My family and I have been given a life sentence. We would never be able to get George back. Daddy's our daughter's first love. He would never be able to walk Gianna down the aisle at her wedding, attend those magical moments of her life like a daddy-daughter dance, sweet 16 party, seeing her out for prom graduations, and she would never be able to have any personal memories with her father. With a smirk on his face and children present, Officer Chauvin used excessive force and acted against his training. Chauvin had no regards for human life, George's life. I stand before you today asking you to please help us find closure by giving Chauvin the maximum sentence possible, making sure he does his time consecutively without the possibilities of parole, probation, or getting out early for good behavior. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Frank.
Thank you, Your Honor. Here today, of course, for sentencing, gives us an opportunity to speak about other matters that I think are involved in sentencing and where we are in the criminal justice system in the processing of this case. As a member of an elected office representing the people of the state of Minnesota, as well as people of the local community, I want to say a couple of things. And first of all, I want to really thank some of the police officers in the Minneapolis Police Department who, under great pressure, great stress, and to some extent at peril to their occupations, what they've devoted their life to, stuck to their oath and their commitment as police officers to speak openly and honestly about policing and the training that is given and received by police officers. Those officers didn't hide behind a blue wall. They came forward, they told this court and those jurors what they knew about training and responsibility, and I think they deserve recognition and credit for that. I would also like to thank members of the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. Those agents get called in, great sacrifice to their personal lives. Whenever things happen, they go. They did that here, and under really extraordinary circumstances, completed a very professional and thorough investigation. Conducting interviews is hard enough, but conducting them in the atmosphere of the city following the murder of George Floyd was even more difficult. And they did so, I think, above and beyond the call of duty. And I want to thank them for doing that on behalf of the whole prosecution staff. Your Honor, I want to thank the family, the loved ones, the friends of George Floyd. They have been through so much more than families involved in murder cases. He's right. It's a fraternity you don't want to be part of. But they've been through so much more because of the pandemic and because of security, safety precautions that we've had to take. They have been through a lot. At a time when they try to grieve, like everybody does for the loss of someone, they are going through so much more. And I want to thank them, all of them, the family. The court saw a testimony from Philonise Floyd, Courtney Ross. These are people who are trying to deal with their loss, but they have to do it in a very public way and under very trying circumstances through no fault of their own. So I thank them. They have all been models of grace and understanding. And it's really remarkable, quite frankly. I'll, I think, come back to them again in a little bit. Your Honor, we have submitted a sentencing brief. I would incorporate that. I guess I would incorporate my comments today into that memo. But I do think there are things that I want to bring out today in my arguments. For hundreds of years, the court had discretion in sentencing. It was the trial court's decision on what a sentence should be. The recognition that the trial court sat through the trial, watched the evidence, and saw how it affected people, informed the court's discretion. When the legislature passed the guidelines, in a legitimate attempt to try and even out sentences, they defined certain presumptive sentences, as we all know, for typical crimes. For each crime, the typical crime. But they did not remove discretion for sentencing judges. They recognized that nobody is better suited to decide whether this is the typical case represented by that guidelines presumptive sentence, or if there are reasons why this is worse than that. And the guideline still gives this court discretion when there are aggravating factors to give a more serious sentence than what the guidelines presumption calls for. And as you know, we are asking you to do that today. As this court found, there are 4 aggravating factors that we have identified. They go beyond a list of just what those factors are. We have not just done our homework and found a list. The court made good findings, detailed findings about those factors, and we think they justify a greatly increased sentence. This is not the typical second-degree unintentional murder. The Supreme Court in our state has said that, and very recently, even 1 aggravating factor is sufficient to go twice the top of the range. Here we have 4. The first one that the court found is an abusive position of trust and authority. And the court specifically found that when Mr. Chauvin was acting as a police officer, he had a position of trust and authority. That is certainly true. We trust police officers. We trust them when we need help. We call them for help. We trust that they're going to take care of the problems that they are assigned to deal with, right? We trust them. We also give them great authority. We give them great power. We give them power to use force that individuals would be prosecuted for using, right? We give them authority to arrest, to detain. And with great power, of course, comes great responsibility. So they're not sent out there by themselves to do this. They're given substantial training. This court saw all of that through the trial, in general and in specific to Mr. Chauvin and the other 3 officers. They're given training on the use of force, the proportional use of force. The force used has to be warranted by the threat. They're given training on de-escalation because we recognize that police officers are called in when people are not having their best day, when people might be affected by mental illness, drug abuse, any number of issues. They're just having a bad day, and they're trained for that and should be. And they're taught how to use that to de-escalate and control a situation. They're taught medical intervention. They're taught to provide medical attention to people who need it. Being a police officer is a difficult job. We ask a lot of them. It's a profession, there's no doubt about it. But we give them a substantial amount of training, and most officers do it right. This case wasn't about police officers, all police officers. It wasn't about policing. This case was about Derek Chauvin disregarding all that training he received and assaulting Mr. Floyd until he suffocated to death. One of the things that you heard, Your Honor, and the jurors heard that can really encapsulate, I think, a very important issue here. 7 words. In your custody, it's in your care. And it's a real simple mantra. It's a real easy thing to remember. You're going to take custody of somebody, you have to provide care. You have to do it in a caring way. You can't simply disregard their care. Mr. Chauvin abused his position of trust and authority as a police officer by doing just that, just disregarding all his training. It was an abuse of that because what did he decide to do? We often are forced in this, criminal justice system to infer people's state of mind by their conduct and their statements. What was Derek Chauvin's end game here? What was the plan? It seems apparent the plan was hold him down until we can dump him in an ambulance and no longer have him be our problem. You recall he said to Charles McMillan, he's a big guy, might be on something. That's it. He held Mr. Floyd down as Mr. Floyd begged for his life. He had the other officers help in that regard. And rather than doing the simple expedient of putting him on his side, he said, yeah, He was dismissive to that duty of care. We trust that arrestees will be treated with respect, reasonable force, and that their medical needs will be addressed. I'm paraphrasing from the court's findings. That trust was violated. We trust that they will use their authority reasonably, and this was a particularly egregious abuse of that force. Again, paraphrasing the court's findings. The typical second-degree murder does not involve that extent of abuse of a dearly held position of abuse or a position of authority and trust by the community and by individuals of the community. Your Honor found that Mr. Floyd was treated by Mr. Chauvin with particular cruelty. I think tortured is the right word. We know that, we've all seen it. Mr. Floyd did not want to be in the back seat. That's it. That's the rub. It was the need to get him in that back seat no matter what. And we all saw that once he was pulled out of that back seat, he calmed right down. He even willingly went down to the ground. I'm going down, he said. And he went down to the ground, not fighting, not punching, and he was placed initially on his side. He's already handcuffed. He's placed on his side in the recovery position, like he should be, because he's trying to breathe, and then quickly placed prone on the ground, face down. Mr. Chauvin put his left knee on George Floyd's neck, his right knee on George Floyd's back, face down on the pavement. Had Officer King sit on Mr. Floyd's waist area and had Officer Lane hold his feet down. You can even see Mr. Floyd trying to pull his feet up. We all are going to fight to breathe. Everybody knows that fear when you all of a sudden realize you're having trouble breathing. It's just innate, right? We want to survive. We know we have to breathe. And there's an automatic reaction when you begin to feel like that is threatened. And you can see Mr. Floyd going through that. He tries to pull his feet up. But he's held down by these three officers while Officer Tao is looking on. And later, of course, goes to keep the people who want to help away. He's placed face down on this pavement so harshly that it rubs the skin off his face. He has injuries to his face from being face down on the pavement. He has injuries to his knuckles from just trying to lift himself up. And he's telling Officer Chauvin, I can't breathe. I'm dying. And Mr. Chauvin's response was, And all this time, imagine what Mr. Floyd is going through. If we're going to talk about particular cruelty and torture, really try to appreciate what he's going through. He knows he's suffocating. We all know that feeling of not being able to breathe enough. And he's begging, he's pleading, and he's being ignored. His concerns are being dismissed by somebody who has taken custody but not care. He was kept in that prone position for 9.5 minutes and was suffocated. There's no other way to say it. That's particularly cruel. That is more cruel than the typical second-degree unintentional murder. Significantly more. This is not a momentary gunshot, punch to the face. This is 9.5 minutes of cruelty to a man who was helpless and just begging for his life. This court found that there were children present, standing only a few feet from these officers. These children, who were ages 17 and one child age 9. Why is that an aggravating factor? Well, I think everybody can figure that out. Right? It's particularly bad to commit a crime in front of children. We've heard a lot of academia about the development of the young brain and how long it can take. And here you got a couple of teenage girls and a 9-year-old girl. How are they going to process this? Standing feet from a man being suffocated by police officers. Such a stark sight that one of the children even says, we got to call the police on the police. How do you process that as a 9-year-old? The children were not only present watching a man die. We've all seen, if you haven't, you really need to. Look at George Floyd's face. As he's dying, he's suffering. The children have to watch this. But not only that, it's police officers, and there are people around them wanting to help. And at one point, and sure, they got upset. And at one point, Mr. Chauvin points his mace, grabs his mace to keep him back. How does a child look at that? There's another officer screaming at them to get back. The typical second-degree unintentional murder doesn't involve children standing feet away watching a 9.5-minute suffocation of a man begging for his life. This court also made a finding that the defendant committed the offense with the involvement of 3 or more other persons. Lane and King were involved directly in the restraint, and that Tao kept the bystanders at bay. I've already talked a little bit about Lane and King's role in holding Mr. Floyd down. They recognized that he was pulseless, that Mr. Floyd was pulseless at one point, and yet really made no effort to take care of the person in their custody. Officer Tao watched most of the suffocation and then only went over to keep people from giving help. One person who is identified as a medical trained firefighter for the city of Minneapolis, and that was dismissed. Like, are we going to believe her? So they kept trained medical people from providing help. These were all uniformed peace officers, adding to that abuse of trust and authority. I know the defense has asked the court for probation. I'm not going to spend a lot of time arguing that. It's so outside of the realm of, I think, real possibility. This is a murder. I understand some of the arguments made on behalf of Mr. Chauvin. I can't understand what his family members and friends are going through. I can't. But it's certainly not enough for a departure to probation for a second-degree murder. We believe, Your Honor, that these 4 aggravating factors and the findings that the court has made certainly justify an upward departure because there are 4 of them, not standing alone, but in a sense, not overlapping, but coming together to show this is not the typical second-degree murder. This is egregious. And this justifies a double upward departure. From the top of the box, which is 180 months, we're asking the court to do a double departure, recognizing all 4 factors, to 360 months. As I mentioned before, Your Honor, this is sentencing. This is the time for victims, right? This is the time for the loved ones of the victim and the community to have a say. Again, I commend this family. I commend all of the loved ones, the friends, the people that have been involved in this case for tolerating and being gracious. None of this, of course, can bring George Floyd back. That's very true. But this is the time for our criminal justice system to say, we hear you. This is the time for their criminal justice system to say, we recognize that this harm you're going through is real, and while we can't feel what you're feeling, we know we can do what your criminal justice system should do and recognize the severity of this crime and reflect that in the sentence to be given. It's time for this criminal justice system to say, we recognize this is more serious than the typical second-degree unintentional murder. The 4 reasons the court found reflect that and give this court more than an adequate basis to do that. Your Honor, we ask the court to impose a sentence of 360 months, commitment to the Commissioner of Corrections. As you know, Your Honor, there are no fines in murder cases. And we would ask the court just to reserve the issue of restitution, so we can clarify that with the family and present that to the court for 30 days. Thank you, Your Honor.
Anything further from the state?
No, Your Honor.
Okay. Mr. Nelson. I'm sorry. Mr. Blackwell?
I'm sorry, Your Honor. Just thank you, Your Honor. Your Honor, at this time, the defendant's mother, Carolyn Palenti, would like to address the court.
If you could state your full name, spelling each of your names, and proceed when you're ready.
Carolyn, C-A-R.
We're hearing right now the mother of
Palenti,
former Officer Derek Chauvin speaking right now. This is the first time we've heard from her speaking on behalf of her son in the defense. Let's listen.
I am the mother of Derek Chauvin. I am here to speak on behalf of my entire family. On November 25th, 2020, not only did Derek's life change forever, but so did mine and my family's. Derek devoted 19 years of his life to the Minneapolis Police Department. It has been difficult for me to hear and read what the media, public, and prosecution team believe Derek to be an aggressive, heartless, and uncaring person. I can tell you that is far from the truth. My son's identity has also been reduced to that as a racist. I want this court to know that none of these things are true and that my son is a good man. Derek always dedicated his life and time to the police department. Even on his days off, he would call in to see if they needed help. Derek is a quiet, thoughtful, honorable, and selfless man. He has a big heart, and he always has put others before his own. The public will never know the loving and caring man he is, but his family does. Even though I have not spoken publicly, I have always supported him 100% and always will. Derek has played over and over in his head the events of that day. I've seen the toll it has taken on him. I believe a lengthy sentence will not serve Derek well. When you sentence my son, you will also be sentencing me. I will not be able to see Derek, talk to him on the phone, or give him our special hug. Plus the fact that when he is released, his father and I most likely will not be here. Derek, my happiest moment is when I gave birth to you. And my second is when I was honored to pin your police badge on you. I remember you whispering to me, "Don't stick me with it." Derek, I want you to know I have always believed in your innocence, and I will never waver from that. I have read numerous letters from people around the world that also believe in your innocence. No matter where you go, where you are, I will always be there to visit you. I promise you I will stay strong, as we talked about, and I want you to do the same for me. I will do what you told me to do, take care of myself, so I will be here for you when you come home. Remember, there is no stronger bond or love than a mother's love. One final thought I want you to remember. Remember, you are my favorite son. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Mr. Nelson.
Thank you very much, Your Honor. It is my intent that my remarks this afternoon be quite brief. I do not intend to relitigate the facts of this case, nor spend any substantial time looking at the law. The court is very familiar with the facts of this case, and the parties have fully briefed the court relevant to the sentencing factors. And we recognize that in any case, any sentencing that comes before the court is tasked with a difficult job. The court must craft a sentence that serves the interests of justice, a rather nebulous term. The court must take into consideration the victim impact, public interests, as well as the circumstances and the history of the defendant. And in this case, more than any other that likely any of us have ever been involved in, that task is exceedingly more difficult. In my remarks today, I just wish to briefly address each of those three considerations, starting with the public impact. As I believe we are all cognizant of, this case is at the epicenter of a cultural and political divide. We tried to keep a lot of that out of the courtroom during the trial and make this case about the facts. But we recognize what has happened as a result of this case. There are a great number of people who will view any sentence you pronounce as overly lenient and insufficient to satisfy justice. But there are an equal number of people who will view any sentence you pronounce as draconian or overbearing. Either way, some percentage of the public will view your sentence as a miscarriage of justice. The intensity of the public interest in this case cannot be understated. I trust that the volume of correspondence that each of us has received from the public at large is indicative of these very sentiments on both sides. As I was informed just yesterday, the Attorney General's office established a website, web submission, to accept community impact statements. Again, in my understanding is in a little over 2 weeks they received over 1,000 submissions. Again, on both sides. By my very best estimate, since my representation of Mr. Chauvin began last summer, I would estimate that I have received over 5,000 emails, over 1,000 voicemails, and hundreds of handwritten letters. Again, from both sides. And I expect that Your Honor has likewise been inundated with public comment and scrutiny. The impact that this case has had on this community is profound. It goes far beyond what happened on May 25th of last year. It has been at the forefront of our national consciousness, and it has weaved its way into nearly every facet of our lives, from the entertainment that we consume to the presidential politics, from protests to conspiracy theories. In the end, it is my sincere hope that when this proverbial dust settles, the community impact brings forth principled debate and civil public discourse, and ultimately leaves a positive effect on the city of Minneapolis, the state of Minnesota, and the United States. But nevertheless, while this court may consider the community impact, it is for these very same reasons that the court must turn to the foundational legal principles and remember that justice is blind. Law is built on reason and common sense, and it cannot be permitted to be assailed by public opinion. Turning to the second consideration, which is the victim impact, the death of George Floyd. The death of George Floyd was tragic. He is loved by his family members. He is loved by his friends. And his death is justifiably mourned by those whose lives he impacted. He is a son, a brother, a father, an uncle, and a friend to many. And as the court heard today, the impact and the loss of his life, simply just, it can't be simplified. And it will take time. Finally, Your Honor, the court must take into consideration, just like it has to take into consideration the aggravating factors, it needs to take into consideration the mitigating factors. And the mitigating factors as set forth by the sentencing guidelines really point to the TROG analysis, essentially, ultimately in this case. I'm not going to spend a lot of time, again, arguing for a probationary sentence. That's briefed. But that being said, when we look at the TROG factors, who is Derek Chauvin? Derek Chauvin spent 19 years as a Minneapolis police officer. He loved being a police officer. I was contacted during the course of my representation and have had numerous conversations with his fellow police officers or fellow police officers that worked with Derek, some retired, some still active. And they told me that he was a solid police officer, that he did his job, that if somebody asked him to do a particular task, he never complained, he did it. One person told me that one of his sergeants told me that if I had asked him to dig a ditch for 8 hours, he would have picked up a shovel and he would have never complained for a second. He would have done his job. He was decorated as a police officer. Multiple life-saving awards. He was decorated for valor. He was proud to be a police officer because what he liked to do was help people. And as the statistics show, the vast majority of police work is helping people. He was proud to be a Minneapolis police officer. He served his country as the United States in the United States Army. And he too is a son, and a brother, and a father, and a friend. He too, his life, the life he's lived, he's not coming into this as a career criminal with 6 points, 5 points, 4 points. He's coming into this never having violated the law because he lived an honorable life and he attempted to live an honorable life. Derek Chauvin was not even scheduled to work on May 25th, 2020. He volunteered because there was short staffing at the time. I know from numerous conversations that I've had with Derek that his brain is littered with what ifs. What if I just had not agreed to go in that day? What if things had gone differently? What if I never responded to that call? What if, what if, what if? The truth of the matter is, and the end result is that we are here after a jury verdict, finding him guilty of these offenses, and the court's consideration should not only be focused on the aggravating factors, but the mitigating factors as well. The Minnesota Sentencing Guidelines Commission was established for a reason. And yes, the court in circumstances like these has discretion to go beyond and aggravate a sentence beyond the presumptive sentences established by the sentencing guidelines. But the sentencing guidelines don't differentiate between second-degree murders. Someone robs a liquor store, a police officer is involved in an incident, and a person dies in police custody. The law presumes, the legislature presumes, that the sentencing guidelines as established is a sufficient penalty for all of the second-degree murder categories or cases you would see. From 2019 back to 2010, a total of 90 people were sentenced for second-degree murder. Those sentences, those people, there were more than that, but people who had a 0 criminal history score, more than 90 people were sentenced. 67%, or 60 of those 90 people, received a guideline sentence of 150 months. So 2/3 of all people in this same position received a guideline sentence. 20% received an aggravated sentence, 18 of the 90, and 13% or 12 individuals were granted mitigated departures. So if the legislature and the intent of the sentencing guidelines is to eliminate sentencing disparity, the law should presume that the guideline sentence is what is appropriate in this case. Judge may take into consideration at this point those aggravating factors, but you have to counterbalance them, which is the goal of the law, with the mitigating factors. I know that this has been an incredibly difficult case for the Floyd family to have to endure. The state of Minnesota, likewise, the prosecutors in this case have endured quite a bit, as has Mr. Chauvin's family. This is a case that has changed the world to some degree, and I hope it's positive. But it's my hope that the court follows the sentencing guidelines, applies the law in a reasoned manner, and imposes a just sentence.
Actually, Mr. Chauvin, would you join Mr. Nelson at the lectern? Mr. Chauvin, this is your opportunity if you wish to give any input to the court. And so I turn it over to you and your attorney.
Thank you, Your Honor. At this time, due to some additional legal matters at hand, I'm not able to give a full formal statement at this time. But very briefly, though, I do want to give my condolences to the Floyd family. There's going to be some other information in the future that would be of interest, and I hope things will give you some peace of mind. Thank you.
And I'll note that I did read your comments in the pre-sentence investigation as well.
Thanks, John.
All right, we are going to take a 15-minute recess so that I can complete the sentencing order based on what I've heard today. And let's reconvene at 2:45. We're in recess.
And there you hear it, Judge Cahill ordering a 15-minute recess right now. This is the sentencing of former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin, and it has been emotional and powerful already out of the gates. We did see Derek Chauvin himself for the first time remove his mask in the courtroom and say a few words. He said that he couldn't speak too much because of some additional legal matters that are still ahead. He wasn't able to give a full formal statement, but he did say he turned back into the courtroom and addressed the Floyd family directly for the first time and said, "I want to give my condolences to the Floyd family." And he also said, and this was interesting, and we didn't quite know what to make of this, there's going to be additional information that I think will be of interest to you. We also heard from Derek Chauvin's mother, and that was another surprise. We were not expecting to hear from her, Carolyn Paulenti, and she said that Chauvin has played these events over and over in his head multiple times. She's seen the toll that it's taken on him. When you sentence my son, you will also be sentencing me. She also said that I want you to know, speaking to her son, that I've always believed in your innocence. Of course, emotional testimony from the Floyd family as well. We saw a heartfelt message from his 7-year-old daughter, Gianna, who says that she misses her dad and she loves him, and that she thinks about him and that somebody hurt her daddy. And we also heard from his brothers, who were choking back tears trying to get through their testimony at this sentencing as well. There's a lot to unpack here, but during this break, I want to go around the horn here and talk to the people we have. We have our senior national affairs correspondent, Deborah Roberts, here. And wow, a few surprises already. You were talking to people about this case, getting a ton of reaction from Chauvin's mom, and then he himself removed his mask and spoke.
That's right, Whit. And I have to say, it was a stunning moment to hear from his mother. I think so many people were waiting to hear some words of maybe either condolence or maybe some heartfelt words of a remorse on the part of her son. And this hasn't gone unnoticed on social media. So many people feeling sort of outraged, if you will, that that she didn't really acknowledge George Floyd's death. And I think for a lot of people of color in this community, it sort of speaks to that feeling of just being ignored. You heard George Floyd's family talk about his life mattered. And you didn't hear that in her comments. And I think that that struck a lot of people. His attorney actually did reference his death a minute ago. But I think for a lot of people, that was a very stunning moment. And I think that speaks to what so many people have been feeling in this country, particularly people of color, about a life mattering. It's not about a black life only mattering, but a black life matters too. And I think that's what people were probably really struck by when they heard her speak about her son.
And we heard George Floyd's brother, Philonise Floyd, speaking directly to Chauvin, essentially pleading with him, you know, I want to hear from you. Tell me why you did what you did. I wonder what the Floyd family is thinking about what they heard from Chauvin himself. And that last little bit, it was interesting. He looked at them, he expressed his condolences, but then said that there might be more information in the future that would be of interest to you.
Yeah, very cryptic comments. I cannot imagine that that gave them any source of comfort. I can't imagine anything that was said, even by his attorney when he acknowledged George Floyd's death, that brought any comfort. I haven't heard from anybody, and I've spoken to a few people over the last few days. I haven't heard from anybody who really necessarily wanted to hear from Derek Chauvin. I don't think anybody expected that they would hear anything. But I can imagine that a lot of people wanted to know something from that family when they heard from his mother, something that kind of acknowledged George Floyd's death and suffering and the loss that his family so poignantly sort of pointed out. And you certainly certainly didn't hear that from his side today.
And you described after the conviction and the trial, for many it was a sigh of relief when that conviction came through, and now a lot of people across the country are holding their breath to see what happens in the sentencing here. Want to bring in some others to discuss as well. Let's get to Dan Abrams, our chief legal analyst. And Dan, as I come to you, I just want to point out these 4 aggravating factors because there's been so much discussed about this, and I believe we have a graphic to give some explanation. Remember, he was convicted on 3 counts here, but the most serious charge, second-degree murder, that is what the judge is considering. But in addition, you have these 4 aggravating factors. They're up on the screen there: abused position of power and authority, particular cruelty, presence of children. There were people under the age of 18 who witnessed this killing and committed a crime with the active participation of others, and those, of course, the other officers involved. But Dan, my question to you is, the defense attorney there, Mr. Nelson, said that it's not just the aggravating factors, but also the mitigating factors. What did you make of the case they were making?
Well, first of all, we have to remember the judge has ruled on the question of the aggravating factors, meaning the prosecutors came to the judge and said, we believe that this sentence should be above the typical range because of these aggravating factors. They actually argued 5. The judge accepted 4. So right there, that tells you that the judge is very sympathetic to the prosecution's argument. He's saying, yes, these are aggravating factors. Yes, I am going to take these into account. But there is no specific formula for how many years each one of the aggravating factors necessarily gets. You're right. The defense attorney, Mr. Nelson, referred to potential mitigating factors. I think the strongest argument he has is a statistical one, right? To say, of the people who have been convicted of this crime with no criminal background, this is how few have gotten a higher sentence. Problem is that the judge has already ruled that they're aggravating factors, therefore saying this case is different. It's not just like every other case involving second-degree unintentional murder. And so, as we talked about earlier, I expect that the judge is going to go over the 10 to 15-year range. The question is just going to be, how far above it does he go?
Let's bring in Sonny Hostin as well, ABC News legal analyst, former prosecutor, also co-host of The View. Sonny, it's good to have you with us. I want to get your response to what Dan said there, but also one of the big questions coming into this is, would Derek Chauvin himself speak? We heard him speak. He admitted that it would have to be limited in what he said, but did his words help his case in any way today?
I don't believe so. And I will tell you, the lawyers, of course, in the courtroom, I think made the appropriate legal arguments that we expected to hear. The judge, as Dan mentioned, had already made his determination as to the aggravating factors here. And judges most often times have already made a determination as to what the sentence will be. The factor that is really most important in my experience with is these victim impact statements. And I've been in courtrooms many, many, many times trying my own cases, and I never know how these victim impact statements go. The victim impact statements presented by the Floyd family went as well as they could possibly go. You have Gianna Floyd, a 7-year-old who has lost her father to cruelty, to suffocation, to murder on video, 9.5 minutes, saying that she missed her father, that he used to brush her teeth nightly with her. She wanted to play with him, that he was there in spirit, noting that he was a present, loving father. That was very important. Each brother, nephew, they all said, we want the maximum sentence. This is a hole in our family. I think Felonious in particular said, my family got a life sentence here. On the flip side of this, we didn't hear any colleagues of Derek Chauvin, no police officers that he has worked with throughout his career saying, don't judge him by these 9.5 minutes. He is my friend. He is my colleague. He is my former officer colleague. We didn't hear from any siblings. We didn't hear from any clergymen. We didn't hear from anyone except for his mother. And I will say this, his mother did him no favors. She offered no condolences to the Floyd family. She professed his innocence to a murder that we all saw all saw worldwide on video. She also said some things that I found particularly callous, in fact. She called him honorable. She called him selfless. She said that a lengthy sentence would be sentencing her. She also said that he was a good man. Well, I think the response would be a good man doesn't kill someone, doesn't murder someone that he knew. And so when you look at the victim impact statements here, I don't think that the judge will, Judge Cahill, will change in any way the sentence that he went into this hearing thinking about imposing.
And we know that the Floyd family, we heard it repeatedly at the sentencing, that they want the maximum sentence available. Going back to Philonise Floyd there, he also said that my family and I have been given a life sentence. We will never be able to get George back. I do want to bring in our Alex Perez. He is in Minneapolis outside the courtroom. Alex, you've been on this story since the very beginning, from the incident itself to the protests to the trial. Just want to get your take on the mood and tone around the courtroom and leading up to today.
Yeah, well, you know, the family has been saying from day one when this incident began that they want to make sure that George Floyd's life, his death, was not in vain. They want to know why this happened. That question about why, we heard Philonise ask it in court during his victim impact statement, and they didn't get an answer. Even though we heard from Derek Chauvin for the first time, we heard from Derek Chauvin's mother, they never address that question. Why couldn't you get up? Why didn't you let him take a breath? And I have to reiterate what some of our colleagues there have been saying. It's been noted by everyone. Chauvin's mother's statement. There were no condolences to the Floyd family. There was no expression of remorse during those comments that she made. And then when we saw Derek Chauvin stand up and talk for the first time, he extended his condolences, but there wasn't a clear sense of remorse about what had happened. And also, in the courtroom, we learned a couple of things that we did not know over the last year. We learned that Derek Chauvin, according to his attorney in court, was not actually scheduled to work that day, that he called in and they were a short staff, and that's why he decided to come in and be on the job that day. And as we all know, that was the day that George Floyd lost his life. Now, one thing we have to point out here, Whit, is just how unusual it is that we are talking about this. Police officers are not often prosecuted, and very rarely are they convicted. Only 9 police officers in the last 16 years have been sentenced to prison time for killing someone on the job. Derek Chauvin here will be the 10th to do that. Now, we expect that the judge here, Peter Cahill, who's known as a moderate sentencer, is really taking all of these factors into consideration. As Sonny said, there's a chance that perhaps he's already made up his decision, but we saw him in court there listening very intently to all of those victim impact statements, listening to the prosecutor, Matthew Frank, who repeated over and over those words, the 7 words that police officers are supposed to remember when they're dealing with someone: in your custody and in your care. And the prosecutor, Matthew Frank, saying clearly that Derek Chauvin violated that mantra. Prosecutors asking for 30 years behind bars. We'll see what he's going to decide in just a few minutes.
Absolutely. Alex, thanks to you. We want to go to our Chief Justice Correspondent, Pierre Thomas. And Pierre, I just want to pick up on what Alex was saying there, expressing just how rare it is to see a police officer there convicted of murder. And here we are now at the sentencing. And there's been this year of racial reckoning, protests, renewed calls for police reform, justice reform. Your take on what we heard today, and really what has changed in this country since the death of George Floyd?
Well, it is exceedingly rare to have a police officer convicted and sentenced in the way that we expect to see in a few moments. Law enforcement officials have been watching this case so intently. And I have to tell you, I've spoken to a number of law enforcement officials, and not a one supported Derek Chauvin in the way that he acted. They all talked about the callous nature in which George Floyd was killed, the way that Chauvin had his knee on the back of George Floyd's neck, killing him as casually as if he was reading a Sunday newspaper, one official talked to me about. So they know that this case has had enormous implications for the issue of policing and on the issue of whether black people are treated fairly by the criminal justice system. Law enforcement officials have been struck by the notion of this question of black people being treated as suspects first and citizens second. And one of the things we know is that in the broader community, the white community, some attitudes have changed. In 2014, roughly 44% of white Americans thought that black people were treated unfairly by the criminal justice system. By last summer, that number had jumped to 62%. So attitudes have changed in this country. Also, we know that law enforcement officials now are facing changes in the states. 17 states now bar chokeholds and those kind of tactics by police. So we have seen some change. But at the end of the day, this is a challenging issue. We had a person of color killed in that community within days of the conviction of Mr. Chauvin. There will undoubtedly be more. And now the question is, how will the country continue to move forward, especially at a moment when crime is rising and police are needed more than ever.
And to your point, Pierre, Matthew Frank, the Assistant Attorney General of Minnesota, made a point. He said it this way. He said, this is the time for our criminal justice system to say, we hear you. And a lot of people are paying close attention to those words. I want to bring in our Terry Moran as well, our senior national correspondent. And Terry, you've been following all this. Give us a big picture here, because this was not just one incident of police brutality. This was not just one bad apple police officer. This sparked this moment of racial reckoning, these protests across the country, but also a national moment of looking inward and reflection.
It sure did, and we heard that in this sentencing proceeding, excuse me, just once, when Derek Chauvin's lawyer, Eric Nelson, said this case is at the epicenter of a cultural and political divide. Now, no man should be sentenced because he's the symbol of something like that. But today, preparing for this sentencing hearing, I was put in mind of Emmett Till, who my mom told me and her other 9 children about. The young man, boy, really, who was from Chicago, killed in Mississippi. I was thinking of Fred Hampton, the Black Panther leader in Chicago, who, when I was a boy, I remember reading and hearing in riveting detail his police murder. And you can't help but think that's why we're here. That's why 2020 turned out the way it did, is because our country has a history of violence against black bodies, committed with impunity. And after this video taken by young Darnella Frazier went viral across the world, the country rose up in large numbers. I actually think Eric Nelson did the country a disservice when he said, well, half will think this sentence is too draconian and half will think it's not enough. I don't think it's 50-50 on this. You look at who was in the streets last year. Primarily young people, because it's young people we depend upon to push the world forward. But there's no question they were from all different kinds of backgrounds, all different kinds of ages. The country rose up because our history here is in that courtroom. And that's not something, once again, that the judge can sentence for, but there is something about trials that speak about our community. And he does, as a judge, as a good judge, understand that. That will be part of his sentence.
You mentioned Fred Thompson, Emmett Till. The big difference now, it was on video and social media, and the entire country and the entire world watched what happened. We are waiting right now for Judge Peter Cahill to bring the court back in session. Once again, this is the sentencing of former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin. Powerful, emotional moments so far. There you see it inside the courtroom. Should come back in any minute here. Let's see, do we have time for one more? Let's go ahead and check back in with Deborah Roberts here. You've been following this, listening to what everybody's been saying. I know I've been seeing you on your phone communicating with people. What are some of the people you're talking to? How are they reacting to what they've heard so far?
I think for a lot of people, it's not a big surprise. I mean, I think people sort of expected, as Sonny said, you would hear the impact statements. Of course, people were touched by the Floyd family saying, you know, their lives had been irreparably changed by this. But I think more than anything else, what I'm hearing from people is whatever happens, whatever sentence the judge gives here, Judge Cahill gives here, for a lot of people, it doesn't really change a lot because, you know, there are statistics that show that black Americans are 3 times more likely to be killed at the hands of police than white Americans. As you've heard some of those other statistics about people who have been, you know, even since the Floyd verdict, people who have been killed at the hands of police. So I think for a lot of people, there's sort of this resignation. Yes, they feel relieved that this is finally a case that shows some accountability, but yet there's still, I think, a resignation that a lot still has to be worked on, that there's still got to be some reform. And a lot of folks are saying things like, you know, this is, yes, finally a relief, but it doesn't really completely change the system yet when you look at a lot of these cases. I mean, even just 1 week before George Floyd, the case of George Floyd and Chauvin was found guilty, Daunte Wright was killed in Minneapolis. So there's still cases out there where, you know, people have been harmed at the hands of police and there has not been accountability. Yes, people are calling for maximum, and you see that a lot on social media, but I don't really know that that's going to be a cure and it's sort of going to, you know, sort of satisfy people in the way that maybe you hope it will.
And you touched on this. We've seen a lot of reactions so far to Derek Chauvin's mother, Carolyn Pawlenty, and we actually have video of that moment when she was speaking. And this is the close-up on Chauvin. And during the trial, people noted that he didn't respond emotionally very much. But we did see, as his mother was speaking, those tearful moments on her behalf. We saw him close his eyes for a period of time. But very mixed reaction from people on what she said, the substance of what she said, and many accusing her and Derek Chauvin himself having more remorse for, you know, her son than for the Floyd family. That's what we've been hearing from a lot of people.
You're certainly hearing that a lot on social media, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that later tonight. I think Sonny was absolutely right, though. I don't think she did her son any favors. I think when we saw her step up to that podium, and we never heard her speak publicly before, we expected that we would hear something that would give us a little bit of humanity, a little window into her son. And she talked about his life and the fact that she would be hurt and harmed, but we never heard her acknowledge the Floyd family. And I think that was really, really shocking and saddening.
It's a difficult day in the courtroom there, and there have already been a number of surprises. Again, we're still awaiting Judge Peter Cahill to call the court back into session. But just to remind people about where we are and where we stand right now, Derek Chauvin, once again, convicted on 3 separate charges. But because of the laws in the state, he right now, the primary charge that is of consideration is the second-degree murder charge, because that is the highest charge of the 3. And then you have the 4 aggravating factors. If we have that graphic, you can put that up, because there's been a lot of discussion about this. Those 4 aggregating factors will play into what the judge ultimately decides in terms of the sentence there. And we heard that the prosecution talking repeatedly about what all of this meant and how this could play into his ultimate sentence. And let's bring Dan Abrams back into this, because there are these factors in terms of what the sentence could ultimately be. But, Dan, there is a wide range. We're talking 15 to 40 years, and the defense says probation and credit for time served. How likely is that?
Well, I think even the defense attorney was recognizing that parole probation isn't happening, right? It's why he doesn't even want to argue it at this point, because it's a non-issue. So we know that the sentencing range is 10 to 15 years. We know that the judge has said, yes, there are aggravating factors. We know the prosecutors are asking for 30 years, and we know the max is 40 years. So you're talking about somewhere in the range of 15 to 40 years. I think that the most likely scenario, sort of taking it out of the sort of broader implications of this case, would be to presume that the judge is going to take the guidelines of the 15-year max.
Sorry to cut you off. We're going to go back to Judge Peter Cahill. Court is back in session.
I wanted to thank everybody for being here and for providing the input you did. Not just the people who were in the courtroom here, but also those who provided written statements, both from the Floyd family and the defendant's family. I've read all the impact statements that were submitted earlier and listened carefully to all the input here today. And it is truly appreciated that you took the time to stay with this case and to provide me with input. I have reviewed the pre-sentence investigation and carefully considered all the facts of the case and the law, but my comments are actually going to be very brief, because most of it's going to be in writing. I have a 22-page memorandum that is going to be attached to the sentencing order. And why am I doing it in writing? To emphasize the fact that determining the appropriate sentence in any case, and in this case, is a legal analysis. It's applying the rule of law to the facts of an individual and specific case. And that is why, as opposed to trying to being profound here on the record, I prefer that you read the legal analysis that explains how I determined the sentence in this case. What the case is, or what the sentence is not based on, is emotion or sympathy. But at the same time, I want to acknowledge the deep and tremendous pain that all the families are feeling, especially the Floyd family. You have our sympathies. And I acknowledge and hear the pain that you are feeling. I acknowledge the pain not only of those in this courtroom, but the Floyd family who are outside this courtroom and other members of the community. It has been painful throughout Hennepin County, throughout the state of Minnesota, and even the country. But most importantly, we need to recognize the pain of the Floyd family. I'm not going to attempt to be profound or clever, because it's not the appropriate time. I'm not basing my sentence also on public opinion. I'm not basing it on any attempt to send any messages. A trial court judge, the job of a trial court judge is to apply the law to specific facts and to deal with individual cases. And so, Mr. Chauvin, as to count one, based on the verdict of the jury finding you guilty of unintentional second-degree murder while committing a felony under Minnesota Statute 609.19 subdivision 2 paren 1, it is the judgment of the court that you now stand convicted of that offense. Pursuant to Minnesota Statute section 609.04, counts 2 and 3 will remain unadjudicated as they are lesser offenses of count 1. As sentence for count 1, the court commits you to the custody of the Commissioner of Corrections for a period of 270 months. That's 270. That is a 10-year addition to the presumptive sentence of 150 months. This is based on your abuse of a position of trust and authority, and also the particular cruelty shown to George Floyd. You are granted credit for 199 days already served. Pay the mandatory surcharge of $78 to be paid from prison wages. You're prohibited from possessing firearms, ammunition, or explosives for the remainder of your life. Provide a DNA sample as required by law. Register as a predatory offender as required by law. And then you will receive a copy of the order and also the attached memorandum explaining the court's analysis. Anything further from the state?
If this needs to be said, we just ask that it be executed forthwith.
Defendant is remanded to the custody of the sheriff to be transported back to the DOC or whichever custody is currently holding him. Anything from the defense?
No, Your Honor.
All right. Thank you. We are adjourned.
And there you have it, the sentence passed down from Judge Peter Cahill. He said that his words would be brief, and they were. 22 and a half years. When you add up the months that he just mentioned there, that is the sentence for Derek Chauvin for killing George Floyd on that day last year in Minneapolis. Let's get right back to Deb Roberts, who's with us in the studio. You've been hearing from people about their expectations. People said they wanted a stiff penalty. Folks you were talking to, what do you think they're going to react to with this?
Well, we heard the Floyd family asking for maximum. We've heard people, on social media. I've talked to people who said they thought the punishment should fit the crime. Listen, as Dan Harris said, it wasn't the 15 years, but it certainly wasn't the max of 40 years. I can imagine that some people will be disappointed. But again, you have to remember, this is a police officer who was convicted of killing a man, a black man in America. It doesn't happen very often. The numbers are very small. Less than 2% are ever convicted. So I would imagine for a lot of people, there is still some satisfaction that there was actually accountability, because at the end of the day, that is what you hear so often from people, that rarely is there accountability. And there certainly was in this case. It certainly wasn't a slap on the wrist, as I would imagine many people, will definitely attest to. Wasn't the maximum, but he certainly got a very hefty sentence for what we all witnessed, this traumatic killing of a man. And maybe for some people, maybe for some, it restores some faith that there can be justice. Still a lot of cases out there that haven't been decided, but there is justice, at least some measure of justice in this case. And I would imagine we're going to hear that from a number of people today.
I want to go back to Alex Perez, who's been following this case from the beginning. He's there in Minneapolis outside the courtroom. Alex, you have spoken with the Floyd family on a number of occasions. I don't know if not very much time has passed so far, but what do you make of the sentence, 22 and a half years, and what you expect their reaction would be?
Well, Whit, I can tell you the family wanted the maximum sentence, and we all sort of knew going into this that the judge would probably land somewhere in the middle of that. The family says they did not want the minimum sentence, and they did not get that. But to them, ultimately, this is about bringing justice for George Floyd and also making sure that his death was not in vain. I remember interviewing Terrence Floyd, and he said he will continue to talk about his brother every day until change happens here in America and across the world. And I think this sentence handed down by the judge today shows that this was much more than just a slap on the wrist. 22 and a half years for this murder, which was captured on video there. So the family, I'm sure, is receiving this with mixed emotions right now. But I can tell you, just in talking to people on the streets over the last year, they wanted to see this through from the very beginning, from the first time they saw that video up until this point, the sentencing. And many people are already now starting to talk about the trial of the other three officers, former officers, which will happen next year. So this is one step in a bigger step process. But in talking to people in the street with protesters who, of all backgrounds, who have come together, because you have to remember this case, despite the sentencing today, has already changed America in many, many ways. People of all backgrounds have come together for a common cause, and we've seen that across the country over the last year and 1 month. And so seeing this sentence, recognizing that what this police officer did was wrong and sentencing him to 22 and a half years, this is what a lot of people have been asking for. Just this recognition that police officers do not always do the right thing, and that black people, particularly here in America, often have to deal with situations like this and the justice does not come to them the way it does to other groups. Now, we also heard the judge in court talk about how his decision was not based on public opinion, but we all know how the criminal justice system here works in America. It's not just to punish those who violate the law, but it's also about deterrence, to make sure things like this don't happen again, or if it's going to happen again, we know that you will be punished for it. And I think we're seeing that in the courtroom here. The judge spending a lot of time talking, recognizing this moment here in Minneapolis, in Minnesota, but really across the country. Everyone was impacted by this, and the judge wanted to make sure that everyone heard that. Whit.
All right, Alex Perez for us. Thank you so much. Yeah, the judge saying that he didn't want the sentence. It was not based on emotion or sympathy. It was a legal definition that he needed to give, given the crime. Let's go back to Dan Abrams. Dan, forgive me, I had to cut you off before as we brought the judge back in. Those aggravating factors you were discussing, they turned out to be factors in this sentence.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember when thinking about the sentence that he's starting from the 10 to 15-year range, right? I mean, this is not a first-degree murder case. This is a second-degree murder case. This is a second-degree unintentional murder case. And as far as that goes in the state of Minnesota, this is a stiff sentence. Now, some people are going to say it's not stiff enough, should have been higher, et cetera. But it is clear that the judge took those aggravating factors into account. It's also clear, by the way, that he'd written the opinion before we heard from the impact statements, right? You don't go back and write a 22-page opinion in a matter of moments. So it is clear that he knew what he was going to do, that he was assessing this as what he views as a legal matter, taking into account the sentencing guidelines, adding the aggravating factors onto that, and interestingly, telling the court that he doesn't want to speak too much about this. He wants his words in the actual opinion to speak louder than what he says in court.
Dan, thank you. I just got something right in front of me here. This is a response from attorney Ben Crump, who's been representing the Floyd family here. And again, the Floyd family was asking for the maximum sentence. He tweeted here, 22.5 years. This historic sentence brings the Floyd family and our nation one step closer to healing by delivering closure and accountability. So that, again, from one of the attorneys representing the Floyd family. Let's go back to Sunny Hostin here. We heard the family asking for the maximum sentence. They didn't quite get it, but 22.5 years, significant, and in Crump's words, historic.
It is historic. It is significant. I have never seen this kind of sentence when it comes to accountability in terms of police violence. And in looking, I'm looking at my notes. I mean, we're talking about second-degree unintentional murder. And while that is not an intent crime, it's an unintentional murder. It's without intent to cause death. But let's remember, it is with the intent to inflict bodily harm. And so we saw that infliction of bodily harm on video for 9.5 minutes, and the judge took that into consideration. He also took into consideration the fact that he was in this position of authority as a police officer and the particular cruelty that we all saw. And so I will say, because of the cruelty of it all, I think this was, an unusual upward departure, which is what we call it in legal parlance, and that is a significant upward departure from 10 to 15 years to 22.5. He is, I believe, 45 years old. If he serves that entire sentence, he would not get out until he is 67 years old. If he serves about 15 years, which is the norm, he would be about 60. He's also facing federal charges. Let's remember that. And let's also remember that being in prison as a former police officer is very difficult. He will probably spend a lot of time in solitary confinement. So not an easy 22 years to serve either.
Sunny, thank you. We are just looking at a live picture here. Just wanted to point out this is in Minneapolis, the memorial there, the makeshift memorial for George Floyd. No doubt the word about this sentence is starting to spread quickly on social media. We can see more people showing up at the scene. I do want to go back to Pierre Thomas, our Chief Justice correspondent. And Pierre, you made the point earlier that there were law enforcement officers who worked with Derek Chauvin, who testified in court against his actions on that day. Clearly, that was a big part of this sentence.
It clearly was, because in no way did anyone who I would consider a professional law enforcement official think that this was the appropriate way to handle that case. And if you take a step back from this case, and if you look at the issue that everyone is sort of talking about around the edges, at the end of the day, this is a human story. And this is a story about race as well. You recall that when police responded to the scene, this was not about a crime of violence. This was not an armed robbery. This was not about an assault. This was about a counterfeit $20 bill. At the end of the day, George Floyd is dead over a $20 counterfeit bill. And that's the question that many African Americans and many people are wondering about. Why is it that that man died over something that simple?
Really hits home, Pierre Thomas, for us. Thank you. I also want to bring in Terry Moran for another final thought here. Terry, as we are seeing people show up there at the memorial site there in Minneapolis, I wonder what this sentence is going to mean as word spreads across the country.
That is now an iconic place in American history and in the world. People come from all over the world to go to the place that is now known as George Floyd Square. And I think in our history, sometimes you're living through history and you kind of don't notice it. It passes by relatively uneventfully. Every single American knows that from the moment you saw that video, from the moment the country saw that video, the shock and horror, the visceral response every decent human being had to that video. We've been living in a moment of American history, and we've been living the history of our oldest challenge in this country, 400 years of it. Can we live together in real justice and harmony? This is a chapter in that. This sentence today, probably will be seen as a step forward, but we know our history. It's one step forward, lots of steps back, but the country is awakened to this issue in a new way. George Floyd likely, let's hope, did not die in vain.
Terry, thank you. And we're seeing more people there in Minneapolis showing up at that memorial site. Deb, I want to go back to you. We were actually talking before the sentencing hearing began about healing and what this would actually mean for healing the country that has been through so much over the course of the last year. Ben Crump himself says one step closer to healing. And I see you've been talking to a lot of people about this.
Well, you know, I think for so many people, it's hard not to feel the personal effects of this. Even as Terry just talked about, we all went through this trauma, not just black people. And I'm the mom of a black son, and I certainly have felt it. I mean, but we all witnessed this, and we went through this case and this trial. So it's been a traumatic time, I think, for a lot of people. We know that there's still more charges to come, more officers to face charges in this case, but this kind of closes the chapter on this part of the George Floyd story. And I do believe that for some people, there will be some measure of satisfaction. Doesn't happen very often, particularly when it is a black person who was lost at the hands of police. But I think for a number of people, and certainly I would say for this mom, it is nice to see that this case is sort of put to rest, at least for now. And I think that for a lot of people, this will be maybe some measure of healing.
Like you said, closing one chapter. There still is more to this story.
Absolutely.
Deborah, thank you so much. And thanks to our entire team for the coverage of Derek Chauvin's sentencing, 22.5 years in prison. Our coverage on this story continues on ABC News Live and abcnews.com. Of course, we'll have a full wrap-up on this and that breaking news out of Florida, that 12-story building collapse. Our David Muir is there covering the tragic events. He will be there live tonight for World News Tonight. For the entire team, I'm Whit Johnson in New York. Have a good day.
This has been a special report from ABC News.
With so much at stake, so much on the line, more Americans turn here than any other newscast. ABC News World News Tonight with David Muir.
We have made it through another week together.
America's #1 most watched newscast across all of television.
Admit it. These days, what you need to know